Thanks for checking in on the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge video today. I'm just going to show you briefly where we're going to be located. From down here in southeast Portland, we went north about 25 miles or so, up I-5 to Ridgefield, Washington, and then just a little bit west out to the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, which you can see is located in a complex of wetlands out here near the Columbia River. Super rich area for a ton of wildlife, federally protected, mostly focused on migrating birds, swans, ducks, geese, things like that. But in this video, I'm going to tell you specifically about some trees that grow out there, a special kind of oak tree that's a keystone species for some natural communities in this area. We're going to talk about a subspecies of white-tailed deer, which is protected in this area as well and has a pretty cool adaptation to its habitat. And then we are going to talk about subspecies of Canada geese that overwinters here as well, and some interesting connections to their summer habitat up in Alaska. And then the other thing I'm going to show you is a recreation of a Native American longhouse constructed within the National Wildlife Refuge. So here we go.
But it does have a little lightning bolt to it. Bye-bye.
We've got some Oregon white oaks, even though we're up here in Ridgefield, Washington. These are keystone species for a lot of areas down here in the Columbia and Willamette valleys. Support up to 200 other species that depend on the oaks. They've done a bunch of restoration of the oak communities.
Well, what's also interesting is those are familiar with poacher, you know, the British Columbia.
Look at me. I want to jump into your hand.
This white oak is over 400 years old.
Papa, can I jump?
This is a spot where some Doug firs were cut down to make room for the oaks. This kind of management is necessary now because the oak woodlands used to be maintained by fires set by Native Americans, but now with fire suppression, we have to do other things to support the oak communities.
All right, so there you've got the Oregon white oak, super cool keystone species that is the heart of an endangered natural community in our area. Something like 95% of the white oak woodlands in the Willamette Valley are gone, converted to agriculture, urbanized areas. Vineyards has been the most recent thing they're getting converted into. But at the same time, there's a ton of restoration going on. We can see some of these other restoration projects on Stovey Island, on Elk Rock Island in the Willamette, and on, where is it, Mount Talbert Nature Park down in Clackamas. So tons of places to see these oaks. And a cool twist that I learned up there in Ridgefield, the Doug fir that were cut down to open up space for the white oak were actually provided to a local native group, the Cowlitz tribe, to do restoration in one of their creeks for salmon habitat. Salmon need these big tree trunks, coarse woody debris we call them, in the streams to slow down the current and provide them refuges during times of high flow. So it's actually kind of a double project, right? Cutting trees out of one area to help the oaks grow, and then putting them into a creek to help the salmon over there as well.
Well, that's a big flock. Right? That's a big flock of birds.
Big flock of dusky Canada geese.
Now that's a bird.
All right, our next species that we're talking about is the Canada goose, specifically the dusky Canada goose. I didn't get a bunch of good pictures of them. They were mostly pretty far away. You're probably familiar with what a Canada goose looks like. The duskies are a dark variation, right? They're the darkest subspecies, and there's a lot of them that spend the winter up there in Ridgefield, and they come down from Alaska, which is their nesting grounds in the summer, and spend the winter at Ridgefield and a couple other spots in the Willamette Valley. They're very small subspecies, one of the smallest subspecies of Canada goose in the Pacific Northwest, And there's an interesting connection to their nesting habitat up in Alaska, which tends to be in the Copper River Delta. So not a huge area. This area experienced a huge earthquake back in, when was it, 1964. Big mega thrust earthquake, similar to what we could potentially experience down here in Oregon someday. But it lifted up the whole river delta by several feet in an area that was already very close to sea level. And so what happened is a lot of their nesting habitat changed from wetland, seasonally flooded, to upland, meaning it doesn't really get flooded. And so a lot of trees and brush and bushes started to grow in, which provides cover for their predators, things like coyotes. And so all of a sudden, this habitat that the geese had been relying on for so long was not a great place to raise chicks anymore. So they've become pretty endangered since then. And this overwintering habitat that's protected for them down here in Washington and Oregon is super important for continuing their existence as a subspecies. So the other species we're going to talk about that we saw up at Ridgefield is the Columbian white-tailed deer. Sorry, again, I don't have better pictures of it or any footage, but it's looks about like a deer, about like a white-tailed deer. You know, where I came from, back in the Northeast, white-tailed deer are like pigeons, right? So I come out here, I learned there's a whole refuge dedicated to these things. There's another one farther downstream on the Columbia that has them as well. And I'm like, what? You got a refuge for white-tailed deer? Turns out these are actually pretty rare. They are the only subspecies of white-tailed deer that lives west of the Cascades. Most of the deer we see around here are black-tailed deer. So these things are actually pretty rare. And they have a super cool adaptation to their environment, which I don't know if you can see it. Take a look back at those photos if you want. It's a buck, and what you can see about the antlers of the buck is they curve in. Almost every other type of deer has antlers that curve out like this. But the Columbian white-tailed deer, their antlers curve in like this because they are adapted to living in really thick, brushy, kind of wetland areas. And so with their horns pointed in, their antlers pointed in like that, they're less likely to get them caught on things as they're pushing their way through dense brush.
This is a recreation of a plank house, similar to the ones that Chinookan people lived in this area. Built from red cedar logs. Up to a dozen families would have lived in a house like this.
All right, one more thing you can see up at Ridgefield, if you get up there, is this recreation of a longhouse or a plank house, similar to the ones that Native people lived in this area. Lewis and Clark actually camped very close to this site when they passed through in 1805, and there was a village of about 900 people living in a series of these plank houses. Lower Columbia was super rich fishing, hunting, and root and berry gathering grounds for Native people, home to a thriving population. Pre-colonization. And this plank house now has educational events, really interesting examples of Chinookan art that are included in it. So hope you get to see it. Thanks for checking out the video, and think about getting up there to check out Ridgefield.